Today we're not going to be doing a Linux tutorial. Today instead we're going to be doing a Symfony tutorial. I was on Discord last night and I was speaking to you guys, doing some code reviews, and the question came up regarding Symfony containers and Symfony services. At what point does a Symfony service get instantiated? And I thought this would be a very good demonstration piece, so I'm going to try and do this in a tutorial now. I know that we haven't done Symfony before in the How to Code Well channel, so I will be skipping over quite a bit of stuff, some foundation stuff, which I will like to do in the future tutorials. But anyway, we're going to dive into the tutorial, which just is a very simple Symfony application. What I've done is I've just removed the guts from the default control of the index action, so we're just literally spitting out that twig template. Scroll up here into the views, and I've just removed the contents off of that as well. So if I was to go to the browser and refresh my page, we should see, yep, a complete blank screen. Excellent. So we now have a blank slate to play with. What we're going to do is create a service, and then we're going to play with when it is instantiated. Okay. So I'm going to do a slow walkthrough, I guess, on creating services. I know already I've skipped over a whole lot of stuff regarding Symfony, but I really want to focus today on those services and the containers and when it's instantiated, when it isn't instantiated, when you can force it to become instantiated, and so forth. So the first thing I'm going to do is create myself a new folder in the app bundle. We're going to call this helper, like so, and in here we're going to create a new class, and this class I'm going to just call as checker. Okay, so in this class I'm just going to have a private variable. We're going to call this is valid, and what I'm going to do in this tutorial is I'm going to throw in a lot of bad practice, because then I can talk about that in good practice terms later on. So if you see any code smells in here, then just bear with me until the end of the tutorial. So we're also going to have a public function, and we're also going to call this is valid. Again, a code smell, I know. And that is going to have a value coming into it. So that is just going to be variable val. We're going to equal that as a default to be b. And then we're going to simply have if is if val is equal to a, then we're going to set this is valid to be true. Okay, then what we're going to do after the if statement is simply return this is valid, like so. So it's just a very basic class, really. We have this one method here, which is valid, passing in the string of well, in this case the default is B, but it could be A or C or whatever. But if the value is A, then we set the is valid to be true. Now the reason why I've set that to be false to begin with is to demonstrate that it will be set to false when the class is instantiated. In this method, then, we return that that property. So this is going to return a Boolean. Okay, good. So now in so that's the checker. Now in the default controller, what I need to do is pull back that service, pluck that service out of the container. We do this using the this get, and we pass in the service ID, the service sort of reference, if you will. And that's a string, and we need to define that, and we do that within the services.yaml. Now the services.yaml, it could be in the bundle, but what I've got at the moment is I'm just going to put it in the default services in app, in the top level app config. So the services part here, we're going to have app.checker. This could be called whatever you wish, but I'm just going to keep it app.checker. And then we're going to define the class, and that is the class path, the path of where that class lives. So in this case, it's app bundle, and then it is helper, I think I put it in, and then it's checker, like so. Okay, so now let's scroll down to the default controller, So now I can do app.checker. That is going to pluck that out of the container as a class. So we can set that, so that is checker like so equals that. Now what I haven't done in here, obviously, in the checker itself, is created a namespace. Namespace is app bundle, and then this is, what is this, helper. There we go, that's good. So that's the namespace of that that class that we've created. So in the default controller, we can pluck that out, like I've said, which means that we have access, of course, to the isValid method on that that class. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set up some basic values and then create a feedback loop so we can actually see what's going on the page. If you're sort of thinking, what on earth are you doing? Just bear with me. This will hopefully come clear in just a second. So let's do a HTML, because what I want to do is print out some HTML to the page. We obviously need to have a value. We're going to set that to be A. We're going to pass that value into the isValid method, and that's going to return a Boolean, like I've mentioned, which means that we can have an internal isValid. Again, bad practice, I know. Let's just call everything isValid today. Equals isValid. Which means that we can start printing some stuff out to the page, because now that is either true or false, depending on whatever that value is. So let's print something out. Let's do HTML, and then let's concat that to be isValid, and then let's also concat that to the isValid value. Because it's HTML, we can have a line break, a breaking rule. And what we've got here, that is a Boolean. Now, Booleans don't display very well in HTML, obviously, because they're Booleans. But what we can do is just simply do a Json encode, because we're going to encode that value into a string, which means that it's going to display as true or false in the literal text, true or false. And then after that is done, we can simply do HTML. So what I'm doing here is I'm passing some parameters into the Twig template. So HTML is equal to HTML. So that will be this string here, isValid, and that will either be true or false. Passing that in to HTML, which means that we can go all the way to, let's close that down. So app, and then resources, index.html.twig. And this is a Twig variable, so we can do HTML, and I'm just going to pass that or pipe that to the filter of raw. Fantastic. So let's scroll down to the default controller. What I'm going to do is just double check my work, make sure that everything is wired up correctly before I refresh the page. So we have the HTML, which is a blank value string. We have the val variable, which is set to A, which is capital A. We have the checker, which is plucking out the checker service from the Symfony container, and then we can access all the bits and pieces off of checker, which we only have the isValid public method. We can pass that in, that val variable into there, which means that that is going to return true or false. Then we have this line here, which will print that out, and then I've gone and printed that out to the screen. So we've got the passing that into the index.html. I just want to double check a couple of things first. So checker, we've got the namespace in, that's looking good, that's looking good. Check on the services. I think that looks cool. So what I'm going to do here is just go back to the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. So we have isValid : true. So that obviously makes sense, right? Because we've passed in A. A is true by the terms of the checker. Of course, if we were to change this to be, let's go back to the tutorial, change this to be B, like so, refresh the page, this will be false. So if we refresh this, it will be false. Fine. Let's put it back to A though. And what I want to do is do this within a loop, because I want to demonstrate how the services get instantiated, or when they get instantiated, and how you can manipulate that. So instead of doing just val is equal to A, let's do an array. So arr is equal to an array of A, and then B, and then C, oops, C, and then D or whatever, anything that is an A. So basically that is going to pass. This should all fail, right? And then we have a for each loop, and we have ARR for each ARR as val, and we're just passing that into the service as before. And because we're concatenating that, that means that the HTML is always going to be printed out on another line because we're using the BR. I thought ahead. So let's save that, go into the browser again, and let's refresh the page, and we should see true, 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 true. Why, though, is everything set to true when it should be set to false? Now, what I'm going to do is just go through the motions. There's probably people out there going, oh, I know, but let's just go through the motions. Let's just break this down a little bit. Let's go back into the code. What I'm going to do is pull back the actual default value of the checker. So let's go into the checker, which is down here. And I'm going to create myself another public function. And this is just going to get is valid like that. And all it's going to do, quite simply, is just return this is valid. The actual property is valid because, like we've said, when we instantiate the class, this should be set to false. So let's save that and go back into the default controller. I'll just drag this over here so you can see it a little bit better. So what I can do is copy that, put that above here, and do default, like so, and then Json Encode checker, and I called it get is valid, like so. I just want to double check that I did call that as it was. So get is valid is what I've called it. Get is valid. Yep, that looks good to me. So here we can see that we have the first one, default, and that is set to false. That is because we're instantiating that service. The first time we pull that out from the container, we instantiate that, therefore it's set to false. We then do an is valid, and that is true. A is true, so that's true. However, the rest of it is also true. Now, this obviously is a failure because the other strings were not set to A. However, this is a demonstration that shows that the services are actually shared in the container. So we're not actually instantiating a new class. We're not actually bringing out a fresh instance of the service. We're literally just bringing back the same instance we had before, and because we haven't reset the value, the is valid property, it's going to use the old one, and therefore it's always going to be true, even though the strings that we pass to the is valid method are going to should set it to false. Let's go back into the code. I'll demonstrate what I mean in just a second. So this one here, this one is the first one that we push through. That should work. That is going to set it to true, which is the case. These are all wrong. These should all be A if they are to be true, but we're not getting true back. That is because when we're iterating over the array here, what we're doing is on the first case, we instantiate the class. On the second case, we pull back that class. We don't instantiate a fresh instance. We pull back that service, and therefore we're going to use whatever is set on the default. And we can go into the checker, like here, and we can actually see the mechanics of this problem. So we put in the value, we default it to B, getting the default, which would be false, which is the first one that we've got. But this is the issue. If val is equal to A, we set the is valid property to be true. We don't reset it if it is false or if it is not A, okay? So we don't reset it. There isn't an else here, which means that this is constantly going to be set, which means that it's going to be set for every shared instance of that service. So there are a couple of things we can do to fix this, and then what I'm going to do, I'll demonstrate those, and then what I'll do is I'll talk about the good practices and so forth. So the first thing we could do to fix this, I guess, is to always set this to be this is valid, set that to be false every time. However, this still isn't fantastic. Let's press save. I'll show you why in just a second. Go into the browser here and refresh the page. Okay, so we've got default is set to false, fine. Then is valid is set to true. Default again is set to true because we're using the same default that was set in the previous instance. We then check all of these things, and because we're resetting them on every check, we have false, 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 and false. So this one here isn't correct. This one should also be false because on every instance of this service, we should be setting it to false. Otherwise, what's the point in having, if I go back to the tutorial here, what's the point in having that set to be false? This private property is false when we can just simply override this by calling this instance in a sequence. So what I'm going to do is just remove that. We're going to save that. The next thing we can do, which is in the services, is actually configure this up slightly differently. As I've mentioned, that these services are shared in the container. We can actually tell the container not to share these services, and so every time a service is requested, a new instance is instantiated. We do this by typing in shared, by putting in the shared property here, setting that to be false, which means that for every time we call the app.checker, we're actually getting a fresh instance of app.checker. So let's save that now. Let's refresh the page. I'll just demonstrate, actually, before I do that. In checker, we've removed that, reset. Refresh the page. And we can now see that the default has set to false because we are issuing or requesting a new instance. We're not sharing that instance among other things. Now, you might be thinking, well, that fixes the problem, surely. But in actual fact, we've only done this a couple of times, like 5 times, right? But just imagine if you're looping over something quite a lot. There is a lot of overhead here. You're getting another class instance. It's not fantastic in terms of performance. Yes, there are times when you need to use it. I can think of several actually, especially with using command line scripts when you're using lots of looping and stuff around those kind of things. But in this context, in this use case, I don't think getting a fresh instance is a good idea. I'm going to be talking about what I would do now. So let's go back into the tutorial. Personally, I think that this class is a bit of a mess. What I'm going to do first of all, though, is just remove the shared part here. So we now have all the services are now shared. Go back into the checker. This, to me, feels like a utility class. This feels to me like it should be returning a value. It should only have a single responsibility. At the moment, it's got more than one responsibility because we're actually setting something. If we're actually setting is valid, and you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, that is the only thing in here. But just imagine this class could be quite big, right? This, to me, needs to be broken down a little bit further. So I don't think it needs to have this is valid because I don't see the point. If we're only returning true or false based on the value that's coming in, we shouldn't be storing anything about that value. If we want to get the status of that value again, we simply just call is valid on that object. We shouldn't be changing the object or the value that is being sent to us either. So let's remove that, and let's remove this. Let's just remove all of that, bring this up here, and close that off. That's good. So what I would do instead is, instead of return that, I would actually probably return a ternary operator. So let's do val and then question mark, and then do equals a, and that's going to be true, or it's going to be false, or else it's going to be false. So what we've done here is we've really simplified the code. So here we're just returning true or false. It's very readable. We're just checking if the value is A. If it is, we're returning true. If it's not, we're returning false. That is exactly what we were doing before, but now we're only doing it in a single line. In fact, I would probably go further than this, and I would create this as a static function. This re-architecture means that we are preventing the use of this keyword, because you can't use this. You can't access properties in a class when you're within a static method. There is no need to, so we shouldn't allow it. So let's save that. Let's go into the default controller and tidy a lot of this up as well. So let's, instead of calling this isValid, because that doesn't work anymore, we can simply do checker, and that is valid, and we can also run that again in here, passing in the value. I'll just drag this out a little bit to make a little bit of room. Bear with me a minute, like so. Apologies for that. Passing in val, so we can remove all of this stuff. And basically what I'm doing is I'm just calling the isValid statically. This one I'm not putting anything in, so I have the default value of isValid, the return value of that. This one I'm actually passing in the val of each one of these. I've removed the shared property from the service configuration. Let's save this and see what we've done on the browser. We're going to refresh the page, and there we go. We have false by default, then it's true, then it's false, then it's false, then it's false, then it's false, which means that we can work on each one of these individually. So let's say I wanted to change the second from last one to be A, which therefore should be true. Go back into the browser here, refresh, and then we have true. Why is that true? Why are these not true? Why are these false? Well, that is because we've created it statically. It's because we're not saving any state within our application. There is no need to for the context of this application. And it is a very sort of single responsibility. Is this valid? If it is, it's true. If it's not, it's false. There's no need in this context to save anything about the object. That should be held against the object, in my opinion, or the value, I should say. So let's just go back to the tutorial. I'll just do a quick recap because I know I've skipped through an awful lot of stuff. So we have a service which is defined in config services.yaml. This is the services section. We pass in the app.checker, that is the ID of the service that we want to use, as well as define the class. Services have an awful lot of options that you can supply. I just showed you one which was shared. If you set shared to be false, then a new instance of that service will be pulled out of the container, which means that it won't be shared amongst the other bits and pieces in your application. It's okay to do that, however, you need to be aware of the overhead in doing so. If we scroll down to the bottom here, we've got the index, which just displays the HTML, and the default controller, which calls that service, looping through each one of these parts here. I'll just drag this out a little bit. Then calling Json Encode to return true or false. Now, like I've said, setting the shared option of the services configuration to be false is fine in some circumstances, but in this case, what I needed to do really is take a step back, take a look at the code, see what it is that I'm trying to achieve. And actually the fix, the most efficient fix, in my opinion, was to do an architectural change and call that statically and not save the state of the isValid value. Now, if you want to access the Discord server, if you want to talk to other programmers as well as myself, and if you want to support the channel at the same time, then I'll put links in the description down below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye.